Welcome, welcome, welcome. Now, I promised my Patreon members that I would do a watercolor in the same duckling so that they could get an idea. So what I did was I did a full-length tutorial, sort of a mini tutorial for them, and it had step-by-step instructions. I told them exactly what colors I mixed. Of course, the video was much slower than this, and I posted it in my Patreon. But I also know that my YouTube followers love watercolor, so I'm just going to give you a really abbreviated version of what my Patreon members received. I just took 140-pound cold pressed watercolor paper. I taped it directly to my table because I didn't feel like finding a backer board. I got out my Cotman sketcher box, and I decided I would just do it with my Cotman watercolors. It's a pretty limited palette. I just did it with some yellow, some blue, some brown, and a little bit of red. And those were the colors I used. And then I just painted in layers. I painted my little duck in the layers, and I let each layer dry before I added another layer. I didn't do a whole lot of wet on wet with this little duckling. He's really cute. I also made him larger, so in case my Patreons wanted to make him into like an Easter card, because Easter is at the end of March. We're looking forward to that because my husband's birthday is actually on Easter this year, so that's going to be exciting. That's going to be a lot to celebrate, and it's his 60th birthday, so it's a milestone for him. So as I did this, like I said, I was going from light to dark. Although the way that I did this is sort of the way that I do my pastels, except for in my pastels, I do my darkest darks first and then go with lights. But in this one, I went with my lightest light. I layered that on, painted that on, let that dry, and then I just went on with my darker colors on top of that. Well, my darkest color. And then I filled in all the midtones. That's a little bit backwards than the way that most people do it. Most people, they put their lightest tone on first, then they want to layer it with a medium tone, then a little bit of a darker tone, and they want to end up the last layer being the darkest tones that they put on there, building up from light to dark. I didn't do it that way. I went straight with my lightest tones, then jumped over to my darkest tones, and now I'm doing my midtones. Now the reason that I do that is because it's so much easier for me to judge once I've got my lightest tones and my darkest tones down, how light or dark to put my midtones. That way I can gauge those. I can decide how light or dark I want those. So that's why I do it that way. It's really not the conventional way to do it. Most people just layer darker on top of each other. They just go light and then just layer darker and darker and darker until they get to their darkest darks. But I didn't do that. And for me, that works out well. It's just how my brain works. Everyone's brain works a little bit differently when they're painting. They have a preferred method or preferred steps that they do. This is how I do it. But now, if you do want to get the supply list, an outline drawing, and the reference photo as well as the watercolor mixes, then consider joining my Patreon at the Dabbler's level. It's only $5 a month, plus you'll get the extended version of this video, not the sped up version. You'll get the actual, I think it's a 30-minute, somewhere around 30-minute little mini tutorial showing you how to paint this cute little duckling with watercolor. And it also gives you some tips about different ways to paint it as you're going, different mixtures that you can make if you don't have the exact color. So that is all in my Patreon, and I do shout out to my Patreon members at the Dabbler's level. Well, all my Patreon members, especially my Dabbler's level, because without you I could not keep on making this content for YouTube. So I appreciate y'all so much. And what I did was, once I got in those lights and darks, now I'm putting in those midtones. I'm trying to decide where the midtones are a little bit darker, a little bit lighter, all while not trying to go as dark as my darkest dark and just leaving my light tones shining through. The most complicated part of this whole painting was the bill. His bill has so many reflections, and then it has a little orange in it. It has some pink in it, some peachy tones. It also has a black, which I did not use black. I don't have black on this palette. I mixed my own dark to be in the place of the black. That's what I'm trying to say. But I really did like this. It was so much easier to do with this limited palette of just blue, brown, yellow, and just a touch of red. The only red that I really used was in the beak to get that peachy tone at the tip of his beak. His egg tooth has dropped off. He does not have an egg tooth. He's a little bit older of a duckling. So the very tip of his beak or bill, I figured out that ducks have bills. So at the tip of his bill, it is a beautiful rosy peachy color. Toward his face, it has a little bit more of an orange tone. Some of that is the reflection of his feathers on his beak. And then like in the middle of his beak, he has more of the blacks and the grays and the white highlights. So I really focused on getting those shapes in there and making sure that they were the correct shapes and the correct color and the correct lightness or darkness. So that's how I approached that beak. I just broke it down into simple shapes and simple colors. I did not think about painting the beak, bill, whatever you want to call it. I did not think about it. I thought about just painting those shapes, breaking them down, made it so much easier and a lot less overwhelming than saying, okay, I've got to paint this beak. Now, how do I do that? Instead, I just broke it down into its shapes and its colors and went right on about my business. Near the end, I added the background. Most people do their backgrounds first when they do watercolor. Again, I do it the way that my brain works. And I really wasn't that interested. I wasn't going to do a background at first, but then I was like, well, he needs a little background. So I painted in this blue color, this sort of darkish, navy-ish blue color, making sure that I let some of those feathers look like they were out there, kind of fuzzy and away from his body, and the light was shining through. And it came out streaky, so of course I had to do another layer for the background because I didn't like all that streakiness. And I just coming back to the beak once those initial layers of the black and the grays were dry and that orange on the side. I let that dry. Now I'm coming back in with the peachy tones and with a little bit of the deeper, more like orangey peachy tones that are slightly darker in some of the shadow areas. Just blending the edges along with my brush so that they're nice and smooth. But I like the way that my little duck came out. He's not perfect, but I like him. And at the end, I always, when I do a lot of brush work like this, and it's a lot of like tiny little marks, I always come back with clean water once it's completely dry and just sort of brush that clean water over the whole thing, avoiding his eyes and his bill, his beak. And that just sort of softens everything, blends it just ever so lightly, and keeps it from standing out. It actually pushes the pigment down into the watercolor paper. It makes it go just a little bit further down so that it is a softer looking, more blended look. And of course, I avoided those eyes, avoided those bills. I want those to stay crisp. Now I'm just coming back in. I'm adding some of the darker little brush strokes, some darker shadows in some areas where I feel like it could use it to make it look a little bit more three-dimensional. Now I let that duck dry, that background is dry, and I'm just adding another layer of the blue to sort of fix some of those streakiness. And I could have even added one more layer of blue and it really would have made it pop and look so much better. But I chose not to because I was just trying to give my Patreons the idea of how to do the same duck. We did it in gouache earlier this week, and now I'm doing it in watercolor for my members. And I just thought you might be interested in watching the process as well. And again, $5 Dabbler tier, you can get the full video along with the outline drawing, the supply list, the mixing, the mixing guide, I like to call it, and the reference photo. So let's see what we've got now. We've let it dry. I'm going to remove this tape. and I think it came out pretty cute. A cute little Easter duckling. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this, and let me know in the comments anything that you would like to see me paint, and I will consider that. So I hope y'all have happy painting. Thank you for watching, and may you have success in all your artistic adventures.